Thank you everyone for joining. This is the breakout panel discussion on financial inclusion and accessibility barriers, and hopefully how we break through them. What we'd like to encourage is for the audience, everyone here, just to chip in, throw in questions to the panel, and what we're going to do is hopefully guide the conversation, get some really good learning points that we can all take away to our own organisations, and see how we can make better access for everyone. I don't know if you're all listening at the start of the main session, but it was a really interesting, just a soundbite from Lord Holmes, who was saying, well, if financial services isn't working for everyone, is it working for anyone? I think that's a really good lens through which we can look at inclusion and accessibility barriers and really kick off this discussion. So I'm Angus McFadgen. I'm a partner and a lawyer, but you won't be hearing too much from me. I'm here as the chair and in my capacity as a member of the Financial Services Council at Tech UK. And joining me on the panel are Dr. Liz McFall of Edinburgh University, sociologist with particular interest in consumer finance and insurance, Dr. Phil Gossett of Nationwide, who's the head of innovation there, Rick Kirkham of Customer Touchpoint, which is a business focused on customer interactions across all channels, so that's both online and offline, and engagement strategies. And last but far from least, Mark Aplin, co-founder of Signly, an AI-driven sign language translation solution, which has implemented its solution with big clients at Lloyd's or Microsoft. So if you've got a web browser open, you can pop up the Lloyd's website and see it in action. It's a really impressive product. Now, let's kick this off then. What I would like to do is to invite first Liz and then Phil to give us a view on what they see as the most challenging barriers are from an accessibility and inclusion perspective. How data and digitalization can help or hinder, and interestingly, just how they've seen those barriers changing over time as technology and digital first becomes an increasing trend in the marketplace. So Liz, our expert, please kick us off.
So thanks, Angus. I mean, I did this last time in an actual room about 18 months ago, and it was a really fun event with great snacks. Unfortunately, we don't have that.
Bring your own.
I've enjoyed listening to the sessions so far. So thinking about how financial inclusion is changing over time, I thought it might be fun to actually look at some of the issues that have been talked about earlier today, but from a historical perspective. So what was before the dominance of digital technology? So I'm going to take you on a brief journey, and people who are a good bit younger than me may not remember this, but others might. So I think there's something to be learned from the historical context of a particular form of finance known as doorstep finance collectively. And that's the kind of product that was offered by the Prudential Assurance Company, most famously, and also on the credit side by Provident. They were very similar companies historically. Provident actually copied the business model from Prudential. But the thing that I want to bear in mind with this, Provident and Prudential offered a very particular mechanism for financial inclusion of a sort. Historically, the poor have always paid more for credit than people with more means do. But the thing that I think is most interesting about that business model for the perspective of contemporary firms working in fintech or the mainstream financial services is that the reason why this form of doorstep finance persisted for over 120 years, despite numerous governments' attempts to regulate it out of business, was something that, without any kind of normative judgment, I think is worth bearing in mind, and it's to do with the role of the human agent. And as you will all know, the role of the human agent in the provision of financial services has been on a long-term decline. But what I would what I think is most interesting is not because it's not the reification of human contact per se, it's how that human contact works as a device or channel to smooth the relationship between the provider and the consumer, to help the provider see the consumer more effectively, more clearly, and to have this kind of feedback loop and ongoing reproduced attachment. Now, social, cultural and technological changes that are easy to talk about if we had another half an hour spelt the end of that sector of the market for all sorts of reasons. But there remain hard questions about whether that sector of the market is any better served, and for how the barriers to participation have changed in the last 25 years. So if human agents were a channel that kept that sector of the market, that business model alive for well over a century, what kind of agents have replaced them? Now, the obvious answer to that is digital agents, digital channels, digital platforms. So that's been a long trend over the last few decades. In sociology, we'd call them non-human agents. And that would be things like price comparison websites, digital customer relationship management, and more recently, the social media conversation, social media interface or front end, price optimization strategies, chatbots, and broader fintech and innovations that have been around for the last few years. So these kind of financial products, there's a far greater range of them, but how have the means of accessing them changed? And is there a potential for improving access through these products? I was struck by how the fintech firm Castlight, which was operating with a model to thicken the credit files of renters, I only discovered today that they are now part of the affordability products offered by Experian. I think lots of people talk about the affordances of fintech for broadening participation, but there are huge barriers to be overcome if that's to happen. So the means of digital participation is the obvious one, that they are not evenly spread across society. And also lower means of digital participation tend to intersect with other existing inequalities. So unequal access to hardware, online connectivity, digital skills, the confidence to even try to start using digital platforms, intersect with socioeconomic, age, disability, ethnicity, geographical location, all those barriers. So it's not a simple matter of thinking, oh, well, how can we cater for people who of different age groups or different ethnic backgrounds? It's a matter of looking at how they intersect. Now, there isn't a simple single formula for that. To go back to where I started from, it is about keeping this channel alive, where the relationship between the provider and the lived experience of the customer is naturally maintained. And one of the things, and this is my last point, one of the things that I think in the fetishization of fintech and disruption and innovation that gets forgotten is the need to maintain and to repair and sustain smooth channels, a conversation or an attachment, which takes into account how people actually live, what is their experience, and how are you listening and adjusting the offer in the context of that experience.
Okay, Phil, can you give us some insights on how you've managed to grapple with some of those challenges in practice and any other views you have on the barriers themselves, please?
Yes, certainly. So let me just start by, I want to explore a few more barriers. Nationwide has just launched an incubator, and it's focused on solving the challenges for those people that are living in financial difficulty. What we've done is we partnered with Fair by Design, and I don't know if you know Fair by Design, but their whole reason for existence is to drive out the poverty premium. The poverty premium is where the poorest in society end up paying more for essential goods and services. On average, it's about £480, but it can be over £1,000. And obviously, if you're paying that much more for just the basics, then this becomes a barrier. It's a financial barrier that traps you into poverty. But as part of this incubator work, we explored further along what are the other barriers there. And the Personal Finance Research Centre at the University of Bristol, and they've done some really interesting work around the relationship between poverty and other protected characteristics. So, for example, if you consider the role of gender, women, typically they're lower paid. They're also more likely to be carers. If you look at race, then the BAME people are more likely to be lower paid or unemployed. Interestingly, when you look at age, the youth, that is people under 35, tend to be lower paid. They pay more for housing, and they're not having the ability to accumulate wealth as many before them did, because it's so difficult to get into the housing ladder. And actually, if you look at disability, that's got the strongest link to poverty of all. But these characteristics are actually much worse if you combine them. So if you can imagine a young disabled BAME woman, imagine how things are stacked against her. And then you have to ask yourself, well, how fair is this? And there are many, many barriers that we need to overcome and to work on, actively, consciously work on, if we want to create a fair society. So that's just a piece that we've been thinking about. Well, that is a lot of the content related to the incubator. And then I architected another incubator we did called Open Banking for Good. And one of the things we were aware of is that you cannot add to this unfairness. So typically when we think of a new product or a service, we think about the size and the type of market we're going to address. But often what you'll find is that the people that are designing the product and service have their own view of what the people in that segment are like. There's this great work that's going on around inclusive design. Fair by Design have been working with a great lady called Bailey Cursor and others to create a report that you can find on the Fair by Design website around inclusive design. But it's clear that if you design for the edge cases, then actually the whole product will be better. And if you can involve these people in the process of designing the product, then that'll give you a huge advantage across the rest of the market. So there's also been some talk, Liz has just touched on digital inclusion. I just want to say it's an area, it's quite surprising if you look at the research into digital inclusion and digital exclusion. I spent some time at Vodafone. Obviously, everybody knows that teenagers were the first to really start texting. But the interesting evolution was that the second largest growth segment was the silver surfers, the grandparents that actually had the time to communicate with the teenagers. And then when I did some work at Microsoft Research, there was some study in Cambridge with the homeless. And actually they found that 85% of the people there had access to smartphones or owned smartphones. So just to wrap up this bit, it's really important. I'm a great proponent of an approach called grounded innovation. And that's about, if you want to tackle a problem, make sure that you fully understand the problem and get the experts in as part of the team that solves it. Go on, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, Phil, thank you, Liz. Thank you as well. What I'd like to do now is to bring in Rick and then Mark, just to give us their perspectives on how they've been able to break through and work through some of these barriers, particularly in the customer interactions, to achieve better outcomes. So Rick, do you want to pick that up first?
Yeah, thanks very much, Angus and Liz. Phil, thought that was really interesting. I think there'll be some themes that tie through some of the comments I'll make here as well. And our focus at Customer Touchpoint really is about supporting organisations to be able to handle their customers' inquiries when those people want to get in touch with them or do something, actual mechanics of your relationship with them. And a lot of focus in contact center or customer contact operations is often about driving down the cost of contact, and actually that goes against a lot of that creates a lot of barriers for accessibility and therefore inclusion of people actually wanting to interact with the organizations and get in touch and get help and support and knowledge, and it really puts barriers in the way. So that sort of relentless drive to reduce cost of contact actually also neglects the fact that a lot of those customers would have a lot of value over and above what it costs you to speak to them on that occasion. So it is a little bit short-sighted, as well as sort of being the right thing to do. And when we're working with our clients and our customers, we tend to look at three main areas, and that's firstly the corporate policy around those customer contact strategies, and talking to May about moving away from that drive to just reduce costs at all costs, but also make sure that when any of the customers want to contact them, they can. So again, there's obviously a big drive to go digital first for a lot of services and offerings and support, and that's absolutely fine in some cases, and plenty of people will take up those services. But we find that the biggest reasons why people will choose to want to actually speak to live support agent, as we would call it, somebody actually there in person. Now, whether that is on the phone or through chat or another means, but some live person-to-person contact, is that if the reason for them getting in touch is emotional, complex, or urgent, or any combination of those three, the likelihood and propensity for those people to want to actually speak to somebody is dramatically increased. And actually, financial services tend to have latently high levels of each of those in some cases. So, and then if you add any accessibility or need or vulnerability perhaps into that mix as well, the likelihood of people actually wanting to speak to a real person, and as Liz mentioned, that human interaction is really important, and that natural feedback you get when you're face to face, you don't get in customer contact type environments because it's not there. So it's kind of harder to spot and easier to ignore at the same time. So there really does need to be corporate level buy-in to understand that this is an issue, this is a barrier to inclusiveness and accessibility, and that there needs to be strategies put in place that don't worry about that reduced cost of contact, that make sure that everybody can get through. And we did a project a couple of years ago for MBNA credit cards just before they'd become part of Lloyds, and they had a big speech recognition system. So one of these ones where you call the number and you sort of, it asks you questions, you speak back to it, and it understands what you want to do, hopefully, or not in some cases. But then, anybody with a hearing impairment, or anybody that's a bit older and might not quite understand what's going on or understand some of the language, this is a great example where corporate policy needs to come into play, because I called one myself on behalf of my 94-year-old grandma-in-law last week, trying to sort a broadband issue out, and we had to go through one of these things, and they were making us trying to repeat the same piece of basic information 7 times before it allowed us to go through and speak to somebody. There's just no need. If we can't give you a simple one-word answer to something once or twice, we're not going to be doing it on the 4th, 5th, or 6th occasion. But the system was in that case put in. This wasn't MBNA, by the way, so it's completely different. But in this case, the system was put in place there to effectively be a barrier to people getting through. And it's difficult, it's stressful, it's upsetting for the customers in some cases. And then the end result tends to be that the call ends up at the wrong place, or they put the phone down and they have to call you back and they try and get through a different way. So you're doubling the contact, you're making it more expensive, and you're creating all sorts of emotions in that journey, which are not good for the customer, but can end up you losing their business as well, which does happen quite often after experiences like that. So that's where we need to say, actually, if we've got any of these sort of systems in place to triage the calls, you have to make sure that they're designed with, it's one thing for a happy path for people to go through, but when it's not working, you then have to be able to take control of that and make sure it's still a good experience for those people who don't want to interact with it or are simply unable to interact with it, so you can still serve them and give them access to the services. And that's really important. So if you can get that buy-in, and then you start to go into the specifics of the different contact channels that are in place, then you make sure that those strategies are there so that they're accessible for everybody, even when they're not working as you might want them to, exactly from a business point of view. So that's the first one. And then there is a lot of sort of good customer experience technology out there. And we've over time developed a method of designing customer journeys, either phone menus or ways of doing chats or SMSs or anything else, which make sure that language is simple to understand, to make sure that there's always a way to speak to the person or the team that person wants to get through to, but also that there's already a way out when it's not working. You can just quickly get through to somebody. And I think where the sort of customer experience technology comes in there is if people have maybe gone online first and have tried to do something and it's not quite worked for whatever reason, at the moment there's still quite a big gap between digital journeys and live support, and actually the information tends to be lost when you go from one to the other, whereas actually now there's some really good tools and techniques you can use, so that actually I've been through some FAQs, I've not quite answered the question, but actually there's a little button there that passes me straight through to a team. I could even flag on that button that I have an issue, I've not been able to read it properly, or I can't use the phone very well because I can't hear, or anything else that you might want to flag. And we can treat that person appropriately, and we can bypass some of the normal routes and get them straight through to some people that have been trained to support them effectively. So you can really put very, very neat, effective strategies in there. And actually that ends up being a much cheaper contact than it would have been had those things not been in place, and that person feels valued and cared for as a customer. And again, particularly with financial services type contacts, it's people's life and their livelihoods and their money and their finances, which again are important to them. So, if you use technology well and you align technology with that corporate strategy, you decide that you actually want to do something and make yourselves inclusive and accessible, then it can be really powerful and effective and deliver a good experience, and actually it ends up making those contacts cheaper in the end as well, which if that's still being measured, then it's useful. And another really big one is that actually when people get through to live agents, again, whichever channel, if there are support and strategies in place to improve that access and that information giving, then the people taking the contacts need to know what you have in place. If they're not aware of it, they can't signpost, and they can't help, and they can't do things better, which again is really frustrating. And one big thing is to take a note of it and log that customer has an accessibility need, so that next time if you recognize their phone number and they call, don't make them go through the menus, just put them straight through to somebody, and then that you can help. And that personalization, it starts to feel for those customers like you understand who they are. And again, you have that double benefit then of them coming through relaxed and calm and engaged, and it really increases the likelihood that you're going to get a good outcome from that contact. So actually, it doesn't have to all be about the cost. There can be some win-win elements to all of this as well. But the agent awareness and signposting is really important. And again, trying to switch this broadband service over a few weeks ago from between two big providers, we'd finally got through, and we'd actually got broadband in 94-year-old Nana's house that took us a couple of years to get there, and put a tablet in so she could speak to us, speak to grandchildren through video, which has been life-changing for her. But the minute we got through and we put the broadband in, the telecoms company said, right now, now of course you're going to have to start paying £3 for your statements. And of course this, when we spoke to her, we didn't quite understand that and gave them a call back, and the reason was, well, because there's now broadband in there, she can receive email statements, she has to pay for them. Not noticing the fact that Joan was 94, not noticing the fact that we discussed her site problems, and that my wife and I have got access on the account to talk about these. There's a lot of clues there that actually could have told that agent that there was other things going on. And actually it turned out that had we just said, or had they flagged to us, actually, are you saying that you need a large print statement? Well, they're free. So there's a lot of clues and signals that signposting and that support could have been offered without having to generate another call. So I think
there's a lot of power for technology to do the right things, but it needs the culture, it needs the business to set it off in the right direction for everyone to have a chance with that stuff.
Yeah, it has to be aligned to the strategy. So if I was going to think about anything, the corporate policy, use technology well in line with that policy, and then also make sure people that are actually taking those contacts are aware of all of the offering and support and tools that they have to improve the accessibility for your customers.
Right. And Mark, do you want to share a bit about your tool and how that kind of helps with some of these barriers that can present as well, please?
So I feel, first of all, in the spirit of full disclosure, I should say I'm not an expert. 3 years ago, I wasn't working in financial services, I wasn't working in access and inclusion, and I wasn't working with deaf people. So there was a lot I don't know, and there still is a lot. In my day job, I actually started working with the deaf charity, and I had a bit of an epiphany. They explained about deaf culture, that is to identify as deaf with a big D, and I hadn't heard of that, I'm ashamed to say. So for this community who use sign language, they don't see themselves as disabled. They're very proud to be part of deaf culture and the deaf community. Have a very rich and visual form of communication, but potentially, in addition to a language preference to have stuff in sign language, because that is their first language, English proficiency is a bit hit and miss. It can be to do with educational provision. So I remember saying, look, I get the fact that this community is deaf, but sure, you can just write stuff down in English, right? And that would be fine. And that's when it was explained to me. And I thought, well, this is pretty shocking. I used to do pro bono work for the charity. I worked in digital, and yeah, I felt quite embarrassed as a hearing person, actually. So deaf people are often reliant on friends and family for support to kind of translate posts that comes through or make phone calls on their behalf. And there didn't seem to be any sort of, there's lots of tech for blind and low vision folk, like screen readers and large print, but didn't seem to be anything for the deaf community. So as a pro bono project, we put together a little app that used a really simple application of augmented reality, where you held up a leaflet and pre-recorded sign language popped over the top. Very long story short, BBC News found out about this hobby project that we've been doing in our spare time, and it appeared on BBC Breakfast at the weekend for 6 minutes on a Saturday and Sunday. And all of a sudden, this little hobby thing is projected into the mainstream. And Lloyds Bank phone on Monday, straight out of the blocks, because they did know all the stuff that I didn't. So financial FCA draft vulnerability guidance had started to sort of lift the lid on the fact that potentially those with hearing loss and those that are deaf were in that vulnerable category. I hate that word, but anyway, still in the vulnerable category. Lloyds knew that this demographic was more likely to visit branch, to be reliant on interpreters, which are in really short supply. And so they said, look, we've got to be first to have a look at this. So they used their sort of corporate might, opened up the customer lab, and we had researchers, they got Deaf Insights groups in, and led a Deaf Insights day. It was absolutely phenomenal. And I just, so the first kind of second epiphany for me, but a massive pivot for us, we showed the little AR application where we had sign language over a leaflet about mortgages, and this deaf user just said, look, yeah, it's really good, absolutely amazing, but the leaflet says go onto the website, right? And there's even more information on mortgages, and there's different types of mortgage, and it's even more English, even more terms and conditions, and really complicated. Can't you just do what you're doing there, but on the website? And so Lloyds looked at me at the Insights Day and said, do you think we could do that? So that's when I quit my day job, and we focused on porting what we called Signly to the website, and it launched on Lloyd's site last year. And in the 16 weeks prior to COVID, became, we think, the world's most deaf-friendly website in terms of volume of content. So a sign language user can access any page in British Sign Language, which is quite something. What's interesting to me, to your point about barriers, is that at the Insights Day, Lloyd's actually prior to Signly had really quite good access provisions for deaf customers, because you could book an interpreter in branch and Lloyds would pay for that, or bring your own and be refunded, or they had video relay as well, where you could bring an interpreter into the conversation to relay between the hearing person at Lloyds and the deaf customer. But the failure rate was 100%. So half the deaf customers didn't know Lloyds did that, and the half that did had gone into branch to kick these things off, and the colleague didn't know that, which I think speaks to some of the points that were sort of raised earlier, that you can have all these great tools, but if nobody knows, it's somewhat pointless. So yeah, that's our story so far. It's definitely work in progress though, because actually in delivering Signly, you realize that a lot of the customer journeys online, you can get so far, but you still get stuck, you reach a blocker. So yeah, work in progress, but not a bad start.
And Mark, you must have had others be in contact since you put it on with Lloyds. Is there a huge growth plan, or yeah, to take this hobby and embed it into more websites? Because it seems, and I'm ignorant like you used to be on this topic. It seems like a really positive way that potentially quite simple. I don't know, you'll tell me it's not more complex. The technology can be deployed presumably with relative ease into new websites and
it's, I mean, it's light
adapted.
touch. Yes. I think it's taken Lloyd's about 5 hours to integrate our code, and that's it. And the rest of it is just managed. So it's bringing sign language into the mainstream, because let's face it, it is 2021 and the tech is there to do that now. I mean, in the past, you might have said, well, to be more deaf friendly, we'll offer video relay, we'll bring interpreters into branch, but there was no real way of keeping any translations on YouTube synchronized with the English. We kind of covered that one off. Microsoft have been really, really supportive and definitely share our values. So Microsoft have helped us a great deal, and actually a couple of weeks ago launched Signly on a test page to do a show and tell and find out what the barriers are potentially in a big tech environment. So I mean, ultimately, how Signly grows is dependent on the deaf customer, because we sign the top 20, top 50 journeys, but then it's up to deaf people to decide, do they want pages translated? So it kind of transitions then to being deaf customer led. They click request translation, but yeah, it's a learning curve, but so far it all works, and everyone seems quite happy.
That's great. That's really positive to hear. Phil, can I perhaps bring you back in from a culture perspective, because Nationwide has got a very strong sort of proposition around doing things in the right way. Do you see culture impacting the business's approach to inclusivity and accessibility and influencing the kind of projects that you pick up through your innovation lens?
So it's I just thinking about this, it's a bit unfair really, because we're a mutual, and as a mutual we're owned by our members, and therefore it's an amazing organization to work for, because actually you always say that we put the member at the heart of our business, but in Nationwide it truly is the heart of everything we do. So any barriers that we can identify that mean that our members are denied access or causes friction for our members, we are hyper aware that we have to stop that happening. So it's a difficult one to answer, because it sounds a bit like we're just singing our praises, but so as an example, we in our collections and recoveries team, somebody is struggling and we think that we can help them, then there's an organization called Income Max. So we refer them to Income Max, and they are able to maximize the incomes of their benefits or whatever. Now, there's a cost to that, but actually the real benefit of that is for the member, and we work for the member. So it makes that's the kind of thing that we can do as an organization that makes clear and business sense to us that maybe other organizations would struggle with.
And I totally understand that. I'm just conscious of time, because time has absolutely flown away with us, and we have just a few minutes left. So I would like to go around the whole group again. I'm conscious that Liz, you've been sitting there quietly for probably about 20 minutes now, and I'd like to bring you back in first, but then to allow the rest of the group to comment, and just to leave the collective group today with your key thoughts on what you think the big opportunities are. What can the industry focus on, hopefully with a tech spin, to help accessibility, to help inclusion over the course of the next year, 2 years, the stuff that's within grasp. So could you share your thoughts with that one, please?
Always remember to unmute yourself. So I think it's a really fascinating question, and it's hard to answer in really narrow specifics, because my tendency is to kind of lean back, and a sociological perspective is to kind of lean back and think about, well, how do these devices integrate with the way people are really behaving, what I would call lived experience. So I think the Signly is a brilliant example of a way of kind of identifying the problem and between deaf culture and financial provision, and sort of closing that loop. And at the most generic terms, I think if digital innovation are to be taken up in a way that will improve financial inclusion, it's always that part of recognizing what you don't know, recognizing those sectors where you really don't know anything about how people are living and what they're doing, and develop mechanisms for listening and reacting to that. So it's another aspect of kind of clearing the channel and making sure that you are open to learning about the bits you don't know about how people live.
Yeah, and I think that reflects a point that Phil made earlier about, I can't remember the phrase for it, but you know, breaking it down and looking at the most basics and fully understanding the problem before you then go and try and solve it. Phil, do you want to just share your thoughts, and then Rick, I'll come to you, and Mark, you can leave us with a cheery message perhaps at the end.
So actually, I was just reflecting on Liz's comment, what she was saying at the start about how the doorstep agents used to come. One of the things that they could do when in building relationships is understand kind of what are the people's goals, frustrations, needs, and wants, and then allowing people to use money in a more effective way to be able to meet their needs and wants. And I think that if there's a problem with fintech and financial services, it's that they see the world as a bank and they see every transaction as money and not around actually money is only there to achieve an end goal. So I think there would, if I could change one thing, if I had a magic wand, apart from the hair, I would probably say that we develop tools that build better long-term relationships, even if they're digital.
Yeah, I can definitely see that, and that's fitting with a number of sort of products that I've seen coming through from providers and fintechs in the sort of broader open finance space, trying to get a better long-term journey rather than a product, a pure single product experience. Rick.
Yeah, thanks, Angus. I think the biggest one I would think about at the moment, and it is readily available, is to achieve a lot of these aims and accessibility and inclusivity is analytics. So in non-face-to-face contact environments, whether it be using the website or FAQs or SMS or web chat or on the phone, analytics is a lot cheaper to put in now than it ever has been. And it can tell you the things that you don't hear yourself. So in effect, it can scan every single contact, whether it's text or voice, and tell you what's going on. And you can set it to pick up all sorts of accessibility needs. If anybody, tags and phrases, if somebody mentions sight issues or hearing issues or learning disability or head injury or any other impairment that would cause accessibility issues. And also you can use it to flag up vulnerabilities like affordability or bankruptcy or anything else you might want to spot. And scanning absolutely everything takes away the reliance on those agents that might not spot it or might not be trained to spot it as well coming through, and gives you the information straight away. And another real advance in that recently, only in the last 6 to 9 months, is the ability for that sort of analytics to support your agents in the moment, even while they're on a phone call. So you can set these things up to give your agents little prompts on their screen pops to say, actually, we think this customer might have this difficulty. We'd like you to signpost this. You can also use it to make sure you're 100% compliant all the time in all aspects of that. If they forget to read a compliance statement or they miss anything else, it's listening in, on text or voice, and it can just give those little pop-ups and those helps, and it can help with all sorts of things, and again, much quicker to implement these days, and the value there to achieve all of these aims can be tremendous.
Yeah, that sounds like a handy tool. Mark, do you want to round us off, please?
Yeah, so I think I've learned technology is obviously not a panacea, but it can start some really good conversations. So at Lloyd's, everyone says, wow, this is amazing. Why are we doing this? So, because surely people can read it on the website for themselves. So that's an internal example. And at the Insights Day, if you'd have said to deaf customers, what can we do to be more deaf friendly? They might have said, oh, could you train more staff to use BSL or things like that? But actually showing them something really different from a tech point of view started that conversation about adding sign language to the website, which had never been done. So I think, yeah, tech can start good conversations. The second thing I love about the way Lloyds have done this, because sometimes you do get asked for a business case or how many deaf people are there? It's not the point. Our executive sponsor at Lloyds said, we have a moral imperative to support all our customers. And I absolutely love that phrase. That's what should percolate throughout the organization. That's our license to operate. Somebody said, why would we deliberately exclude a section of our customer base so stuff doesn't work for them? So I think that's important. And measuring the social impact regularly, actually, what effect is this having on people's lives? It's not just about, was it quick? Did you complete the task? Actually, what's the impact? You know, potentially one young deaf person requesting information on a student loan, going to uni and getting a better job. The social impact of that is huge. That's where the value is. So maybe, you know, let's not talk about number of pages, number of words, number of deaf people. The conversation has to be richer than that about the impact on people's lives.
Yep, well, that's totally consistent, I think, with what we've seen out of the regulators in terms of vulnerable customers, however you categorize that, or whether you like the badge. But culture, culture is the key to unlocking a lot of this using the tools that technology can provide. But there's a lot of positives there. And I think there's some, it's incumbent on the industry now to actually continue to take this forward and embed that culture in those tools. So I'd like to ask you all to join me in thanking the panelists today. We've just about come up to time. I think there's now a short break before the main session restarts. But thank you, Liz, Phil, Rick and Mark. That's been really fascinating and quite uplifting as well.